Hi, everyone. I'm Pam Cantor. Thanks so much for being here. I bet you know that. I want to start with a little bit of background. I began practicing many years ago as a child psychiatrist specializing in trauma. And one of the things that I remember is that children came into my office, and independent of what happened to them, they came with distractibility, with impulsivity, with aggression, and it was independent of event, and very often independent of severity of event. So there was a pattern in this. I never changed what happened to a child. The events stood in their memories. What I was able to change was the way they coped, the way they thrived, and that gave them a set of skills for their future. I learned about the science of stress in the mid-1980s in medical school. And one of the things that was stunning for me was that that information never made it into our education system until very recently. So I had the opportunity to work on a study for the Department of Education post 9/11. And in that study, one of the most stunning findings was that the children who were most affected by 9/11 were not the children in Ground Zero. They were the children in schools in deep high poverty communities. So the organization that I founded then was really based on this core insight that adversity doesn't just happen to children, it happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress, and that stress is one of the most under-recognized issues in the chronic underperformance that we see in our schools. So the core insight that founded the organization started as helping more kids to recover from trauma. What it has become is using the science of learning and development to help all kids thrive. The Science of Learning and Development initiative that you see here is a collaboration of organizations that came together to answer a question. Is there a convergence science that if we knew what it was, it would guide our innovations in practice and it would guide our policies? It turns out there was a convergence science, and we brought it together in 2 recently published papers in Applied Developmental Science. Deb, I think we're making those available on the website. So in this talk, what we're going to do is we're going to summarize human development in 4 key principles. And then I'm going to introduce a design challenge to you. Because what I'm going to ask is that we design for whole child personalization using these design principles. I'm going to ask you to think about the fact that we can't develop a complex skill or a whole child without designing an integrated experience in which that can happen. So this means developing a learner in context, and that's the task we have before us. There are 25,000 genes in the human genome, yet fewer than 10% of those get expressed in a lifetime. So what triggers which 10% get expressed? The answer to that question is what holds the key to human potential. Genes are chemical followers. What that means is that the context of our lives, the relationships and experiences in our lives, are what turns on the expression of our genes. This idea, genes are chemical followers, is not what I grew up knowing. I don't know whether it is what you grew up knowing. But this point means that we have an enormous opportunity to be able to shape the expression of a child's genetic endowment. Okay, can I have some water? Thanks. So genes are little packages of proteins they're surrounded by receptors. And they respond to circulating chemicals and hormones. So the science of learning and development is actually the story of the structural and functional changes that happen in the brain as a result of the experiences in our lives. So there are 4 underlying developmental principles, and we're going to talk briefly about each one. Malleability, context, integration, continuum. I mean, it is a pretty extraordinary thing that you can think about all of human development in terms of these 4 principles. So when we talk about malleability, we're talking about the fact that we are all mammals. And as mammals, our brains develop largely after we're born. So when we think about that, we think about the fact that we're born with a largely undifferentiated brain. So what happens? Our brains actually respond to the experiences and relationships in our lives, and neural tissue, which is the most susceptible to change of any tissue in the human body, becomes more and more specialized for more and more complex functions to do more and more complex things. So this idea that we can influence the differentiation of neural tissue based on establishing the context of a child's life means that we have the opportunity to build healthy brain architecture. When we talk about context, what I'm speaking about is the fact that there isn't any such thing as a child independent of context. When we think about what context is, think about the naturally occurring model of negative context, which is stress. Okay, when children experience stress, it gets under their skin, it sets off their HPA system, it releases cortisol, cortisol moves through the body, and cortisol affects 2 primary systems in a child. One is the immune system, which accounts for the amazingly increased number of health issues that kids have because of stress. But also it affects their limbic system. And the limbic system is the part of the brain that is the thinking, feeling, and learning part of the brain, which is very, very responsible for the negative effects of cortisol. So when I say adversity doesn't just happen to children, it happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress, this is what we're speaking about. But there is another side to this, and the other side to this is the role of positive context. The single most powerful example of positive context that we have is the human relationship. And what many people don't realize is that that too has a neurobiologic correlate in the release of oxytocin. And oxytocin and cortisol oppose each other. So when you hear the phrase about human buffering and buffering stress and how do we build resilience in children, the chemical basis of that is the relationship between oxytocin and cortisol. That is what establishes a child's capacity to be resilient. Relationship is a very overused word. Okay, what I mean by relationship is something that we call a positive developmental relationship that is supported in the literature by key characteristics like attunement and social synchrony. When you think about those characteristics, you're talking about what is sufficiently powerful to set off oxytocin. So we're still talking about context. I want to tell you one sticky, wonderful story about context, and that is the story about Mark and Scott Kelly, identical twin astronauts, one of whom went into space for a year and lived on the International Space Station. I don't know what caused them to check each other's DNA, but when Scott came back, his DNA was no longer identical to his brother's. A year in space caused a 7% change in his DNA structure as a result of context. The third principle is the principle of a continuum, and that is that we spoke a little bit earlier that we are born with an undifferentiated brain. We have the most neurons when we're born, but the neurons are not connected. And as we're going to talk about, connectivity is a tremendously important aspect of what happens in terms of human potential. So there are critical periods. When I was in med school, it was your brain develops by the time you're 5. Fortunately, that is not true. So our brains develop until early adulthood. But the most interesting thing is there are new critical periods being discovered, and adolescence is one of them. There are things that we all know if we've raised teenagers that they know how to do that they could not do as a 4-year-old. Okay, so the differentiation of children's brains results in adolescence in a growth spurt of capacities that they don't have at other times. The process by which the brain becomes more differentiated is a process of pruning, cell death, a process of interconnectivity, so that the brain becomes more and more highly specialized to do complex things. Stress causes excessive pruning. High support environments cause increased connectivity. So we're going to keep coming back to that. It's never too late for children to develop new skills or to refine old skills. And integration, this is one of the most powerful things that we're going to talk about today. The developing brain moves from simplicity to complexity. When you look at gray matter, you're looking at differentiated brain tissue. When you're looking at white matter, you're looking at the highways that connect structures in the brain. The fundamental principle of brain differentiation is called Hebb's law. Neurons that fire together, wire together. This is how the brain gets built. So those pathways that create specialization happen when the brain fires and greater connectivity is achieved. So I want to take a familiar example of a complex skill, and that's reading. Okay, our brains were not born ready to read, and we all know that. But the process by which a brain becomes ready to read has to do with these activities that we keep exposing children to, through which they learn to decode, through which they learn to say things and understand the meaning of what they're reading. And there are many parts of the brain that are involved in reading. One of the things that reading illustrates more than any other is how the activities and experiences that we expose children to produce the complex skill that we call reading. All complex skills develop exactly this way, through the layering of prerequisite skills and then new experiences happening, superimposed on those foundational skills. So here's a vivid example of the potential in what we're talking about here. There are 4 known significant pathways by which children learn how to read. Our classrooms are designed for 1. Okay, what happens to the other kids? They get IEPs, they get labeled, they get extra help. But what if we had a classroom that was designed for all 4 pathways? Then you have more children learning to read with less struggle, and most of all, learning to love to read. So back to the, what happened?
Sorry, my apologies.
That's okay.
I apologize for GSV.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we said at the top, this is meant to be a design challenge to all of you. When I was invited here, one of the things I thought about, if there was ever an audience that could solve this problem, this is the audience. Okay, I want to lead you to the design challenge through 3 seminal bodies of literature. One is the work of Vygotsky. Do we all know who that is? Nodding heads. Okay, Vygotsky in the 1930s was an Israeli psychologist and educator who noticed that there was a zone of proximal development where the best teachers could recognize how to bring children to this zone and knew that in this zone they could keep adding challenge upon challenge upon challenge, and the kids would respond. But what Vygotsky wondered was, A, why do some teachers have it, others don't? And what would be the process by which all teachers could know how to bring a child to their zone of proximal development? This is the 1930s. Okay, in 1984, we look at the work of Benjamin Bloom, the 2 sigma problem. Okay, what Benjamin Bloom understood, he did very large studies, big samples of kids. And he knew that if you combined a high-dose tutoring, mentoring experience with an adult with mastery-oriented content, you could produce a performance change of 2 standard deviations with any student. So the things that these 2 researchers understood was there was something that they were integrating around the understanding of developmental principles. Each of them understood the principle of malleability. They understood the principle of positive context. And most of all, they understood the principle of combining them, not doing just one thing. So I want to get to a more recent example, and that's Fisher and Vidal. This is Kurt Fisher, Thomas Vidal, in 2006. These were the architects of something called developmental systems theory, and they understood and took a constructivist approach to development using the design principle of a web. And it was they who said, you cannot develop a complex skill in a student. There are too many individual context interactions. You have to design an entire experience that then drives the development of the complex skill. So what each of these researchers understood was that you had to create a kind of integrated experience in order to achieve accelerated development. But today, we can imagine a world that Vygotsky and Bloom couldn't imagine, because everything they did without a knowledge of the developing brain. And today we have that knowledge, and we have the access to digital technologies. And digital technologies are specific, they're flexible, they're ubiquitous, and we can individualize them. So when we think about the design challenge, and this is the thing I want you all to solve, is we want to solve for whole child personalization. And when we think about whole child personalization, we're actually solving for an integration across 3 things: relationship, rigorous content mastery, and the acquisition of complex skills. If you try to remove one of those, you won't get the same result. If you combine the 3, you get the most accelerated result by creating an integrated experience. And I want to explain why. The brain is an electrical structure. So what fuels it? What causes the wires to fire? Okay, experience, we spoke about this earlier, context is what drives the electrical circuitry of the brain. So that can happen because of social, emotional, cognitive influences, but it can also happen because of experiences of belief, experiences of challenge, and experiences of support. So it's the integrated experience that sets off the firing of neurons that then produce the interconnectedness and specialization of the brain. The more interconnected the brain, the closer we get to the expression of human potential. That's what we're after. And we have to create the integrated experiences to bring that about. When I think about equity in all of this, I'm thinking about the fact that there is no version of equity that doesn't reduce the stress in children's lives, but that simultaneously harnesses what we've been talking about today, which is the malleability of the brain to develop the complex skills, mindsets, and habits of all successful students. Genes are biological followers. Okay, context drives the expression of our genetic endowment. Classrooms designed for integrated development are the experiential truth that can make this possible for every single student. Thank you. Questions? Okay, I don't know whether there is another, if there is another thing coming in. Okay, we have time. Yeah, we do. Yes.
So, thank you so much for this presentation. I guess, can everybody hear me? Okay. So I'm particularly interested in, I guess my question is, when you think about the way these structures, the brain kind of solidifies at a certain age, if a student is under really high stress, let's say 6, 7, or 8 years old, can you attest to, is it possible to maybe undo whatever damage that stress has done for them at that age as they get older?
I think one of the main points that I wanted to drive home is that the brain is the most susceptible to change of any tissue in the body, and because of that, it can recover. So like the children I saw in my office, you can't take away the fact that the event happened, but you can take away feelings associated with the event. The thing that's most malleable for children are the feelings that they have about the things that have happened to them. It's not the event. Okay. So I think there is one thing that is common to everything I've talked about today, and that is the role of the human buffer. Humans buffer stress, and humans are a big part of the recovery from traumatic experiences. Thank you.
What's the best environment that you've seen designed from the point of view that we've just discussed? For example, have you seen a classroom that actually is designed for multiple pathways?
You know, the classrooms that are really almost always designed this way are the classrooms that we think of as those designed for children with learning disabilities. If you go to any terrific example of a school dedicated to that, it's dedicated to the notion that variability is the rule, and so classrooms are designed for every which way that you learn. So even children who might have a known pathway like dyslexia or like ADHD will still be in classrooms that bypass the stuff that they struggle with and just find another pathway by which they can learn it. So the best models we have are in those schools, but there are examples in public schools and private schools that are doing that. But certainly when I want to see what's possible, that's one of the places that I go to. And it also tells you that it is possible. So. Sure.
Thank you. There's lots of stuff firing in my brain right now, so thank you very much
for
this
presentation.
Good. Quick question on if we look at the David Kolb experiential learning cycle for adult learning, I see a few things in there I think I saw in this as well. I don't know if you're familiar with the Kolb experiential learning cycle.
No, I'm not.
Yeah, then my question might not make sense. But basically what he focuses on is there needs to be 4 elements ready for be there for learning, which is having an experience, having an environment for reflection, observation, having theory, and having an environment for active experimentation. So I was just wondering if there was a relationship between this and that, but I'll try to make the link myself.
I think that when people hear this presentation, they really see it as similar for adult learning as for child learning. So many of the same principles, and especially given what I said before about for how long the brain develops, I don't think there is a reason that these principles need to be different. But I'm not familiar with that cycle. I'd love to learn more about that. Yeah, then I think we'll have to stop because I see people coming for the next.
So based on your research, and I understand that you've also studied gifted children, I'd be curious to know if you think there is such a thing as a gifted child, or every child has a potential to stream into what is now categorized as gifted.
You know, I'm not a fan of those labels because the attributes that children have are not traits. So the potential exists in children to excel at things that they want to excel at. People sometimes say to me, does that mean everybody could be a Mozart? And the answer is no. Okay, there are things that are genetic predispositions that are gifts, genetic gifts. But the other side of this equation, in terms of what we don't do to develop and discover the potential that exists in all children, is by far, I think, the biggest problem that we have right now. And if there are Mozarts in the kind of classrooms that Turnaround works in, no one would ever know it. Okay, because those classrooms are not set up to see it. So I would rather solve the problem of making sure classrooms discover that potential, and I'm sure a few Mozarts will surface in the process. Thanks so much. Thanks.